4 a.m., April the 2nd, 1982. Argentine Navy cameramen film their invasion of the Falkland Islands. Frogmen landed first from a submarine, followed later by the main assault force.
Now, the situation, as you might hear, is that the radio station has now been taken over. If you take the gun out of my back, I'm going to transmit it to you. But I'm not speaking with the gun in my back.
By 7 a.m., after fierce fighting, Government House was completely surrounded.
History bro, how are you?
Hi, Mr. Thrall. It's a pleasure and honour to have a bit of your time. I really appreciate it. If we could talk about the Falklands a bit. Is that what we got on the docket today?
Yeah, well, your channel, I mean, you can see just by looking at your channel, and for everybody watching, I suggest you do. You've got a really good overview of, or not even just an overview, an in-depth, fairly in-depth understanding of history compared to probably someone like myself. And I think we could talk forever, but shall we talk about the Falklands?
Yeah, well, I'd really like to. It was when I first got in touch with you. It was just one of the things that sprung to mind. Of course, your history with the Royal Marines, just to put it in a bit of context, I thought I'd say early on is that, you know, neither of us was there. If anyone's under any weird idea, I wasn't even 1 year old. I was born in 1981. I hadn't even yet had my first birthday when the action went down on the Falklands there. And you were, I don't know, what were you, 10 or 12, that sort of age. But it's part of your regimental history, isn't it? The Falklands. And I'm fascinated by all history, like you say. But anything that's with the British Army or British history, of course, fascinated by. And I've always been interested in the Falklands, like the minutiae of it, what happened exactly, in what order. And I know you've spoken to lots of guys that were there, you know, and so you've spoken to lots of really quite serious individuals that were, you know, really there. So it's a bit of an honor really to pick your brain about it and talk about it if you're down for that.
Yeah, let's go for it. How did you get an interest in the Falklands conflict?
Well, I mean, it's on the list, isn't it? I mean, it's quite a big conflict, really. Technically not a war, but conflict, a police action.
Why is it not a war? Because it wasn't the countries facing off.
No, I think it's just technically, of course, it is a war, isn't it? Warfare happened, but I think just technically it's not a war, because lots of conflicts post World War II weren't wars. Like Vietnam was never, I think, technically a war. It was always a conflict. I think originally it comes from Korea, where there was the massive UN actions, US and British actions in Korea, and the president at the time, Harry Truman, couldn't say it was war. He couldn't sort of formally say it was a war in a press conference, because that is World War III at that point. It was sort of tempting World War III. So he said, sort of on the fly, said, well, it's when reporters said, well, if it's not a war, what is it? Shelling is going on, lots of people are dying. He said, it's a police action. So anyway, it's just a politics thing to get around it, just words, isn't it? But I think technically the Falklands wasn't a war, it was a conflict. But I mean, it's just words, isn't it, really? But yeah, so I thought if we could talk about it, I'd want to sort of, if we're only sort of playing with an hour or so, just sort of do an overview of, to begin with, why it happened. Sort of look at the bit of a history of Argentina and why they did it. And then look a bit at Thatcher and her government and the response, and then maybe talk all about, you know, the actual actions and what went down there. But I mean, if you wanted to say something about maybe sort of the regimental side of it, what a big part of it is for the Royal Marines, the story of the Falklands.
Yeah, I'm all ears, Bo. Go for it.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, the leader of Argentina at the time was a General Leopoldo Galtieri. It's the Galtieri government. And I mean, I think I'm not for the bloody arges sort of view. You know, as I say, I was a little kid at the time. I don't remember it firsthand. So I look at it as like an armchair historian. That's all I am, a history fan with a mic and a laptop. It's as remote to me as the Boer War in a way, you know. So, but I look at like the history of Argentina up to that point, and it is it's quite a sad history, quite a fairly brutal history of what happened there. You know, you look at Perón, the various Perón governments. And of course, he was a civilian, but he was a colonel at first, but he was a civilian. But Argentina had a succession of military governments, military leaders, especially since from 76 onwards. They called it a junta, a military junta, however you want to pronounce that, probably butchering that word. And there was a succession of military leaders there, and this Galtieri was the last one of them. And there was a whole period there called the Dirty War in Argentina, where there was all sorts going down there. It really is a very complicated thing. Don't want to get into it. We haven't got time for that, really, because it really is super complicated, that Dirty War. But it was some sort of internal strife. I mean, tens of thousands of people were mixed up in it and got killed. And anyway, these military governments, the junta, were right-leaning, and their enemies were leftists, communists, if you like. And so anyway, don't want to get into the weeds of all that. You end up with this Galtieri government who, I think the picture was that they'd planned, they wanted to have a war with Chile, because Argentina's perennial enemy is Chile. If I suppose, just historically speaking, the English's main enemy is the French, or maybe the Scotch, you could argue, going back. I think for Argentina and Chile, they're each other's most bitter enemies. I mean, if you look at the map, they've got that massive long border with each other.
Yeah, I think a very high border as well, isn't it? Because it's the Andes Mountains.
That's right. And I think just in terms of just pure military might, Argentina is more powerful, was back then, as has always been, more or less, I think, richer, more bigger population, and certainly their air force then was a lot bigger than what Chile had. And anyway, I think I may have some of these details wrong. As I say, I'm only an armchair historian, but I think Argentina were going to be going to war with Chile at some point in the late 70s there, and for whatever reasons it was put off. It didn't happen. And so I think the idea is that this Galtieri leader, general, sort of had to turn his eye of Sauron somewhere else. He had to do something else. You know, he was like, you've got this military government, and they sort of need to exercise.
Wasn't Argentina in poverty at the time, or some kind of financial collapse?
Yeah, there was all sorts of mass inflation and financial collapse, and a social collapse in many ways. I think again, it's quite a dark thing. This sort of a reign of terror of some type in Argentina. You know, lots of disappearances. That's the classic thing, that people were actually, I suppose it's a cliche in some circles, for people to be disappeared, to be taken up into helicopters and disappeared. And well, this was it. This was the real thing, this dirty war in Argentina. The whole of South and Central America, the Operation Condor, is it, that the Americans, this grand plan to keep leftists and communists out.
Well, don't think me rude, but I've just put my search engine up on the other screen so I can have a little search about the things we're talking about. So keep talking. If you see me looking at that screen,
no worries.
Not trying to be rude.
Yeah, no, of course, no worries. Go ahead, please do. Correct me if I'm wrong on this stuff, because some things, especially with ancient history, because that's really my forte, is ancient history. You can sort of get away a bit with saying, oh, I think this. I think that I read this 10 years ago, so I think it was that. Whereas when you're talking about, conflicts where people died and been terribly maimed and they're still alive and their families are still alive, it's where the rubber meets the road a bit with someone like me, a historian, talking about stuff, and it's still very real for people. So it's, it's not as okay just to say, oh, I think this happened, and just be flippant. So, I'll have to be careful. So if you do catch me saying anything wrong, please do interrupt.
Yeah, you're very humble, mate, and I think it's good you say that. It is, we've always got to bear in mind, haven't we, that people fought, died and got injured, and not just that, there's how many children have grown up with no father because they were killed in the Falklands conflict. I'm a bit like yourself, Bo. I make it I make people aware. I'm just an outside observer, I think that's the best way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I haven't spoken that much on my channel about very recent conflicts and things. So, it's usually more ancient stuff, or World War II at least, things like that. So I'm gonna, be more careful here. I probably will still annoy some people by being flippant about it. I mean, I did a conversation with someone the other day, and they mentioned the Falklands War, and they mentioned it. Well, his atheism is unstoppable, and he's an American, and he mentioned the Falklands offhand as just that it was in the terms that it was a really one-sided conflict. There was no way Argentina could ever have won it, and it was this silly little conflict that was of no real importance, and it's a bit embarrassing even for Brits to keep harking on about it and keep going on about it. When in fact that's, I think, an extremely harsh and glib reading of really what happened. And anyway, in response to that, I said, even more glibly, I suppose, I said, well, you're quite right. Britain has got a nuclear, back then as well, had a nuclear capability, and Argentina hasn't. So, of course, it was always a foregone conclusion. Now, that's a bit of a silly thing to say, as if Thatcher was ever going to nuke Buenos Aires. It was never on the cards, of course. But that is something I thought we could talk a little bit about in detail, is that they put together that task force really quite quickly, and that on the ground, the paras and the Marines and stuff are quite often outnumbered, heavily outnumbered. And, you could look at it as, in hindsight, like someone like me, and say, couldn't they have taken months or a year or more and put together a much, much bigger, much, much more thorough task force, expeditionary force or something, where maybe that could have happened? I don't know what you think about that.
Well, wasn't it that, I mean, we're never going to know the whys or wherefores of this war, are we? I mean, it's not, some wars you can kind of trace the origins behind them, like the banking families, this kind of thing, the corporations and the like. But the Falklands is kind of an unknown, isn't it? Because I can only go on what I've heard people say or write about, or what they said in documentaries. And it did seem like a move by Galtieri, wasn't it, to gain popularity by playing an easy and obvious card that would stir up public fervor and get the country behind him. So that's the Argentine side of things. As far as the British sending a task force all the way, whatever it was, thousands of miles into the South Atlantic, at a time where I think at least our Navy was getting stretched for resources. It's hard to say, isn't it? There's the notion that Thatcher was a strong leader. They've invaded British soil, or they put the freedom of British subjects in jeopardy, and we are going to take action. And the way Thatcher would have said it or Margaret Thatcher would have said it, would be, Britain will show them who's boss, something along those lines, right? But then, of course, Maggie also got massive popularity following that war, didn't she? Or as a result of the victory, if that's the right word, at a time where her popularity was previously suffering. And then you hear that, I think it's even members of her own family had shares in oil in the South Atlantic around the Falklands, right? I'm just putting this out there. I'm not saying that's the case, but yeah, just to sort of go back to what you originally said, there's some things you're just possibly never going to know.
Yeah, I suppose so. If we go back to the actual origin, how it sparked off, I mean, I think it really was a surprise attack by the Argentines. I've seen interviews with members of Thatcher's government at the time. The foreign secretary was a guy called Carrington, the Lord Carrington, I think it was. And he resigned immediately upon it happening, because, it's a pretty old school thing. He's like saying, well, it was on my watch that this thing happened out of the blue. It's only right that I should resign. And I've seen in other documentaries, other people sort of, really senior people in the government and in the Ministry of Defence and stuff saying, yeah, it was out of the blue. We knew they were doing exercises. They were scheduled to be doing exercises all around there, and we knew that was all sort of cleared. And then this attack came out of the blue, because it wasn't just the Malvinas, those islands. There was also South Georgia and a few other small rocks in the sea that they invaded. Like an amphibious attack. One day comes out of the blue, as far as we're concerned, sort of thing. So yeah, I said to you before when we were talking about setting this conversation up, I said something I think it might be fair to say in the interests of honesty, sort of where I'm coming from and stuff. The idea from our point of view for Thatcher's government, I was raised in a Labour household, fairly sort of wishy-washy kind of Labour household, not staunch Labour, but certainly Labour. Thatcher was kind of the enemy. I remember when I was a little kid and Thatcher was the Prime Minister, she'd stolen the milk, that sort of thing. And so I sort of had this narrative that it was somehow cynical on her part to gain popularity or something like that. Or it was all about oil, or had always been about oil, or something like that. And as I got older, or in my adulthood, in my 20s and 30s, read about it and saw various things, and come to your own conclusions, form your own opinions entirely from the ground up. And I think that it was a just war. It was standing up to kind of blind aggression from the Galtieri government. It was a terrible, terrible shame that people lost their lives, but I would consider it a just war if there is such a thing. If some people would argue there's no such thing as a just war. All war is a complete failure of humanity and politics. But if you're going to have them, and if you're going to rank them in quite a glib way of what wars that are more or less just, I think I would feel comfortable putting the Falklands up there.
Yeah, I mean,
how do you feel?
Putting aside any kind of political reasons why we might have gone down there, or why Margaret Thatcher decided to send the task force, I guess we still got to remember that there's people living on this island that want to be British.
That's the key thing, Chris. Yeah,
and not just want to be British, but like they've got their own rule down there. Do you know what I mean? They say how things go. I think the first thing that the Argentines did when they invaded was force everybody to drive on the other side of the road.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that they're British people there. They certainly consider themselves British. I mean, it's funny when you go to places in the world like Gibraltar or various sort of British protectorates or overseas territories, and they've got like the exact same letterboxes that you get in England, or just actually it's a funny, a really telling little anecdote, little piece of evidence from one of the Argentinian conscripts, sort of 18, 19-year-old conscripts many years later, in an interview, saying that when he got to the Malvinas, he was utterly shocked to see that it didn't look anything like Argentina. It looked like England. And that he said even a nail, he sort of found a nail on the floor and it said "Made in England" on it. It's kind of surprising. I've never seen a nail that says "Made in England" on it. But anyway, it's not the point. They were surprised. They'd been told that this was just simply their land that had been stolen from them by the crown, and it was theirs to retake. But the reality is that the people on there, there'd been a plebiscite, hadn't there? There'd been votes various times. Do you want to remain part of the Commonwealth or the British Protectorate? They were all entirely loyal to Britain and had always voted to remain so, and it's the same to this day. But it does hit on that thing of the from the Argentinian side, their not motivations, their motivations for taking it was that they say things like, well, it's part of their continental landmass, it's on the same continental shelf as them. So, but that's nonsense. That doesn't mean anything. Ireland is on the same continental shelf as Westminster. It doesn't mean you automatically. It doesn't work like that. I mean, if you want to look at the history, just a very quick bit of detail, like it was never, Britain had landed there and colonized it and had it as theirs since before Argentina was a country. It goes back to Hawkins. It goes back to like the 15th century or something. And I think briefly, Argentina did sort of, you know, technically own it for like a period of 10 years there. But for hundreds of years, it's been British. And, you know, so that's the way it is. That's sort of the political reality of it. And when they did invade, actually, in 1982, when the Argentinians, you know, sent amphibious landing crafts over and landed men on there and forcibly took it. The rest of the world did say, you know, that's bad. You can't be doing that, because Britain said, we're not having this, right, guys? You know, we're going to do something. And they all sort of, on the political side, diplomatic side, said, yeah, no, it's terrible. We condemn Argentina. We're not going to help you, Britain, in any way, by the way. But yeah, we condemn it, sort of on paper. Because Britain said, Thatcher said just immediately, you know, we're going to do something about this. And our European allies, Lindy Page, the History Channel, Lindy Page has got a funny, he describes this in quite a funny way. All our European allies, you know, countries like Germany and France, they said, oh, of course we condemn the aggression of Argentina, but we're not going to help you in any possible way. So Britain turns to the UN, you know, being a member of the Security Council, you know, one of the big players supposedly, asked the UN to help, and they're like, yeah, no, we condemn Galtieri's government, but yeah, you're on your own. So perhaps we could turn to the mighty NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is always there to protect any member of NATO who is aggressed against. They will have everyone else in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They'll be there to back them up and save them. But NATO, which is of course really led by America largely, they said, yeah, no, you're on your own. Again, we condemn Argentina for this naked aggression, etc., etc. But yeah, you're not getting any planes or anything. Come on. So anyway, Britain really were on their own. America did try to help, to be fair, diplomatically, but again, weren't prepared to do anything unilaterally to help us. So Thatcher says, right, we're going to put together a task force, which was two aircraft carriers. What was it, the Hermes and the one you were on? What you were on? Was it the
Invincible? The
Invincible, of course. You were stationed on the Invincible, weren't you, at some point later?
Yeah, for a little over a year. So
I think the Invincible was sort of cutting edge at that time in '82. It was like brand new, more or less, I think. But anyway, she sends down these two aircraft carriers supported by loads of other cruisers and destroyers and things. 120, 130 odd ships in total, I think the whole flotilla was in the end, this task force they sent down there to take it back. And but it wasn't this, it was sort of a close run thing. I mean, the air war, where we only had, what was it, 20, 25, 30 odd Sea Harriers versus over 100 Skyhawks and all this. But yeah, if you want to get into sort of the detail of what went down, I mean, have you got any other thoughts on sort of like Thatcher or sort of the politics and the diplomacy, how it all sparked off?
Well, it was all what's that word?
Brinkmanship. There was something I wanted to say about brinkmanship. I think that's what Galtieri is really, really guilty of. He didn't think we'd do anything, and we called his bluff.
Yeah, that's a word I don't think I've ever used in my life. Brinkmanship. Yes. No, what was I going to say? You know, we were on a dodgy wicket going down there, weren't we? Because we had to rely on the fact that we still had relationships with Chile. And I think Chile were falling out with Argentina over another land dispute between the two countries. So fortunately, Chile allowed us to land some of our aircraft there for refueling and this sort of thing. And then, of course,
Chile played a fairly big role, to be fair, in some ways. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, and then America sat on the fence, didn't they, for even like a long way through the conflict. And to think towards the end, we were running out of ammunition. And just at that point, I think America sided with us, if that's the right expression, and we got a resupply. I might be wrong on that. I'm just saying the things that I've heard.
Yeah, no, one of the main figures was Alexander Haig, General Alexander Haig. I don't know if you know him or heard about him. He was sort of a big shot sort of on the international stage, a diplomat. I think he was head of the State Department at the time, but he'd been around for years. He'd been Nixon's chief of staff like 10 years earlier and stuff. And anyway, he was sort of one of the big shots for America, who was sort of going backwards and forwards between London and Buenos Aires and the UN, and trying to make, the hot war not happen. Because I think that's what a lot of people thought. That's what everyone thought it would be. Whilst in the 3 or 4 weeks it took to get this task force together and send it down the 7,000-8,000 miles down to the Falklands there, they thought it would get resolved politically before any shots had to be fired. And of course, we know, of course, in hindsight, it didn't happen. But he was one of the main people that did try really hard to make it not happen. And I think at one point, because if we lose one of those aircraft carriers, the whole point of having 2 aircraft carriers is a contingency thing. If one goes down, you've still got another platform to land your planes on. But you kind of need 2. And if one had been sunk or something, which wasn't completely inconceivable, I think America said, you can have one of our carriers. I heard in an interview, one of the really, really senior Navy guys like that, Admiral Sandy Woodward or somebody super senior, said that the Americans had offered one of their aircraft carriers if it really came to that. And I think the logistics, the practicality of that is extremely difficult. You can't just give us one of their aircraft carriers to just start operating. They'd have to operate it themselves. It would mean them being involved in the war. So I don't know how serious or how close that came to happening, or whether it was really ever going to happen or anything like that. But the Americans were in the end on our side, of course. I suppose the special relationship is worth something. But yeah, for a long time, they just wanted it not to happen. They just wanted it to all go away. I think most of the international community just wanted it to just go away, because it's sort of an unpleasantness, isn't it, really, as far as they're concerned. I think a lot of the international community couldn't really understand in some ways why both sides were so serious about it, were prepared to go to war over it. I've heard a really senior American diplomat say, it didn't make any sense to some people, this small rock in the South Atlantic. But it's like I say, sort of a naked aggression thing. It's a matter of principle, because those military governments of Argentina, you say they were definitely going to have a war. Probably, I say definitely, who knows? But there was always conflict with Chile, and in the south there, is it like southern Patagonia? Anyway, the south, Argentina had designs on controlling all of that, I think. And so it was really, really in Chile's interest to help us out as much as possible. My enemy's enemy is my friend and stuff. But they really helped in loads of ways, allowed loads of special forces to land inside Chile and do all sorts of things. And we had, I think that we had, what were those massive bombers? Was it the Vulcan bombers? They were allowed to sort of fly out of Easter Island and stuff to do reconnaissance, high-level reconnaissance, because Easter Island belongs to Chile. So Chile helped in loads of ways. It was really in their interest for Argentina not to win that conflict. What, you all right?
I'm just looking at the map. It seems Easter Island seems an awful long way.
It's way out there west. Yeah, it's way out there west. But that's the whole point. It was sort of really high level reconnaissance, and they weren't supposed to ever know. So they land on the Argentines, invade those islands, and Thatcher decides to get together this task force and send it down there. And that was one of the questions I asked earlier. Because when they ended up the boots on the ground, they did, come into conflict at places like Goose Green and what's the capital called?
Stanley.
At Stanley. All the various battles around Stanley. Quite often, the Marines and the paras and the guards that were there were quite often outnumbered quite heavily. And so, just as a historian looking back at it, I always think couldn't they have spent, instead of doing it as quickly as possible on a not on a shoestring, I mean, it's 2 aircraft carriers, but instead of doing it in 4 weeks flat, couldn't they have taken, this is just a grand strategic level sort of idea, couldn't they have taken 6 months and put together an overwhelming force so that you didn't end up with, like 400 or 500 Marines versus 1,200 conscripts? It would have just been, well, he probably could have forced any garrison on there to surrender, if you built up some sort of crazy, overwhelming force. What do you think about that? What do you think about that idea, just in general, of putting together something in 4 weeks and just going bang? And
well, that's
is that foolhardy even, I think?
A military strategist would debate this till the cows come home, wouldn't they? I bet there's no simple answer to it. The longer you leave, the longer we left the Argentine troops there, the longer they had to dig in to fortify their, their foxholes and this sort of stuff, to put in more air defense, I don't know, bring in more ships, whatever the case may be. That still doesn't necessarily mean they would have won or fought off the British, but it would have meant a lot more people would have died.
Yeah, I mean, possibly. Yeah, I mean, who knows? I suppose. Yeah, it's so silly, really, to try and think what might have happened if you'd done this or that. But yeah, talking about the actual action, I suppose when it started, the British said there'll be an exclusion zone, like 200 nautical miles around the islands, and so in any war you have to get sort of air superiority is the key thing, isn't it? First and foremost, whoever controls the skies. And so this carrier group go in there, and I suppose one of the first things, one of the sort of the headlines of debate or to talk about is the sinking of the Belgrano and sort of the naval engagements that happened before, there were many boots on the ground. I mean, what do you think about the Belgrano and what happened there? Or for people that don't know, sorry, I've been accused a few times recently in comments of assuming people know what I'm talking about without giving any background. So I suppose just real quick, there was one of the biggest ships in the Argentine Navy was the Belgrano, a big cruiser class ship which had massive 5-inch guns, which is massive. It was bigger than any naval guns we had on our ships. So essentially, in essence, it was possible for it to just shoot us. So it's a real threat. And we didn't have the entire British Navy down there. We just had this task force. So anyway, they decide that this the Belgrano is a real and present danger, and they sink it, one of our nuclear subs. Shot her torpedoes at it and sunk it. And lots of men died. I mean, over 300 or 320 odd Argentinian sailors died on that. I think it was the HMS Conqueror was our submarine that did that. And apparently there was, they sent it directly back to the cabinet in London to Margaret Thatcher herself to sort of okay it, which she did. And that's what happened. And I think, well, why it's a talking point is that some people have said that was sort of on one end of the spectrum, her detractors would say that's kind of a murderous act. She's sort of murdering these Argentinian sailors needlessly. Because the things like the Belgrano was steaming away, and they weren't a present threat, and it was against rules of engagement and this sort of thing. And I think nearly all of that is wrong. It was a completely legitimate, I think legally, it's completely legitimate action. It was steaming towards the exclusion zone, and there was nothing to prevent us from legitimately sinking. It was going to be. It sort of had to happen because it turned the entire Argentinian Navy around. They had another battle group with their aircraft carrier that was steaming towards it on the north, and it turned them around, and sort of they never really came out of port again, essentially. So it was that's sort of the talking point. It was. So what do you think about the Belgrano incident?
It's just fucking harsh, mate, isn't it? Full stop. I mean, irregardless of the whys and the wherefores, 323 people died when that ship went down. It's hard to fathom that, isn't it? All the families, the relatives that have then got to live with the fact that not only do they lose their loved one, but you've got the Argentine government are going to play up the fact that they were sailing away from the exclusion zone. People are not going to let that go, are they?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that was the case. I don't think they were sailing away from it.
No, I'm just saying the Argentine government, what with their slant on history and politics, would have it that we were in the right, so to speak. Yeah, no, it's again, there's so many open-ended questions, aren't there, around the Falklands conflict?
Yeah, war is hell. Yeah, I mean, well, after that, the battle group had sort of control of the seas, more or less. But the Falklands are only, I say only, it's quite a long way, but 400 odd miles from the mainland of Argentina. So they could fly their fighter planes, their sort of ground attack fast jets, out there and back. So there was still a war in the air to be had between the Argentine Air Force and the British fighters that we could get off of these carriers. And as I say, I think it was mainly famously the Sea Harrier we had, wasn't it? I think there was only sort of, is it 25 or 30 odd at most, versus what they had a lot. I think they had a few different things, mirages and things, but mainly the famous one is the Seahawk, isn't it? Is it? Oh, sorry, Skyhawk, the A4 Skyhawk, where you see there's lots of footage of those screaming around St. Carlos Sound, isn't there? Very famously, bits of footage. And they had quite a lot. The Argentines actually had a fairly big air force. I think they had over 100 operational fast jets to begin with, anyway, which, is not insignificant at all. But I think the Sea Harrier just proved to be, because that was relatively cutting edge as well at the time. Pretty new, I think. And people just say it was a lot more maneuverable than those Skyhawks, and so we couldn't really afford to lose hardly any Harriers, but yeah, their attrition was just worse in the air war. We were able to shoot down, and one of the things that gets said a lot is that their pilots were extremely brave and did some very risky maneuvers and things, like stayed with it moments before hitting the ground and stuff like that. But yeah, I suppose that's one of the sort of talking points. One of the things that comes up a lot, that whenever you see anything about the Falklands, quite often it is the footage from St. Carlos Bay, where we had a lot of our landings, or a lot of the ships were there, and that's where the Argentines sent a lot of their aircraft to, a lot of stuff went down there.
It's full on, isn't it? If your crew on one of those ships sat in San Carlos Sound, San Carlos Water?
Yeah, St. Carlos Water, I've heard it called St. Carlos Bay.
I mean, it's just beyond belief, to think that at any moment you could be sunk. Yeah, this is war, isn't it? It's not pretty.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, like with the regimental history of the Marines, I mean, you've spoke to a lot of people that are actually there and stuff. I mean, when you were coming up, were there even guys that were, older than you and more senior in the Marines that had actually been there, and you speak to them about what happened or their experience, what they saw and things like that?
Yeah, I've met many fellow Marines that served down there. I guess at this point I should say we call it corps history. Marines being part of the Navy, and obviously regiment being an army term.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. It doesn't bother me, but I know some people will be going. But yeah, it was a real era in corps history, that the 80s leading into the 90s. I mean, the Marines are hard enough, but that period and the events that happened, and the type of Marine that the Navy was recruiting at the time, just led to some seriously hard men. And of course, a lot of Falklands vets made up the training teams at Lympstone. So yeah, you had battle hardened corporals teaching you how to fire your rifle, and you'd hear some stories from them. The most stories I've heard of from my friend H. He's just been diagnosed with PTSD, and he's obviously older than me, only just been diagnosed with it. He's had to live his whole life with the memories of being probably 19 years old, advancing up those mountains into contact, and then having to wait for someone to get shot before you take cover. Sounds a bit crazy, doesn't it? When you advance to contact, as we call it, you don't take cover until you get effective enemy fire. And effective enemy fire is when someone gets hit. I guess the point there is you don't want to start taking cover if you're miles away from the trenches where your enemy is dug in. And he said, Chris, he said, you learn all this stuff in training now about section attacks and putting down sustained fire to keep the enemy's heads down while the other sections or troops move up the hill. He said, fuck all that bullshit. He said, in the Falklands, so everyone just lined up. First thing they did, if they hadn't done it already, was ditch their, we call it battle bowlers, which is your helmet, and put their green berets on. He said, so if you look behind you, there was just a long line of helmets all the way along sort of the bottom of Mount Harriet or Mount Kent. He said all these weapons drills that you go through in how many, what am I trying to say? You go through so many times in the Marines: safety catch, change lever, off magazine, check your all this kind of stuff, which gets drilled into you. Again, he was like, he said, Chris, fuck that. He said, you just charged up that hill, firing your rifle as rapidly as you could. When that magazine was empty, none of this, stow it away in one of your, what we call pouches. He said, fuck that, throw that fucking thing away. Reach in your combat jacket, grab another one. He said, get the fucker on your rifle quick and keep going. When they got back to 4-5 Commando, one of the first things they had on their timetable, on their schedule, was weapons training. And he said the corporal taking the session was like, oh, guys, come on, put some effort in, like, pay attention. And they're like, nah, fuck that, Smudge. And he said it's because they were so just demoralized by the fact of what war is really like, as opposed to perception it would be like from their training. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think maybe nearly every generation of soldiers, certainly when there's a gap of a hiatus between wars, every new generation is kind of surprised by that, it seems. I mean, I saw your interview with, is it Nigel Spud Ely? Is that right, Spud?
Yep, Spud, yeah.
Who was in the Paras at the time and was there, wasn't he? And he went on to be in the SAS. And some of his accounts from it are, really quite harrowing, guys crying on body parts and the whole 9 yards. So yeah, it's like, obviously, that's why I think it's kind of weird that there's some perception out there that it was this rinky-dink little tin pot end of the pier war that was sort of nothing over a rock in the sea. And in fact, there was some pretty crazy actions that went down. The reality is some quite, pretty crazy stuff. I suppose, getting into it a bit, the famous yomp across the island. Well, one of the things was that we did lose quite a lot of ships, like the Sheffield and the Ardent, sadly, like the Sir Galahad and the Sir Tristram, terrible burns, like the Welsh Guards lost lots of guys there, but the Antrim, the Argonaut, the Antelope, the list goes on. But one of the big ones was the Atlantic Conveyor, which was like a civilian ship that got hit. I think maybe might be one of the French-built Exocets, because I think maybe I might be getting some of these details wrong, but I think the Argentine mistook it on their radar for one of our carriers because it was so massive, and fired one of these extremely valuable Exocets they had. They only had like 5, I think, these missiles that we couldn't shoot down. Anyway, the Atlantic Conveyor, this big ship, was hit, and it's really terrible, lots of burns and stuff. But one of the repercussions of that was that it was holding loads and loads of helicopters, our helicopters. And so the idea was to have our men's helicoptered in to Stanley a lot, be doing that quite a lot.
Yeah,
and it couldn't happen because they were all lost in that. And so we ended up with lots of Marines and paras walking across the island. And it's not a tiny island. I mean, we're talking, tens of miles, isn't it? 50 miles or what? I mean, you must know a great deal about the Yomp.
Yeah, well, the helicopters were Chinooks, I believe, and they could have been used to carry, I think a Chinook can basically hold a whole troop of men. and obviously carry them wherever they needed to go. It's like our American brothers and sisters won't go anywhere without fuck that, man, we ain't walking over there. They always wait for the choppers. But a lot of them went, all these Chinooks went down on the Atlantic conveyor, and I think it left 2 serviceable cargo helicopters. That's hence why you hear about this infamous yomp.
Yeah, we lost a lot of sort of our air mobile capability, I think, in that. And so, yeah, it was left with, because I think one of the things, correct me if I'm wrong about this, just sort of the perception I think a lot of people have is that a lot of the boots on the ground in the Falklands were Marines and paras, but there were all sorts there, actually. You know, like I said, the Scots Guards were there, the Welsh Guards, and various other, lots of special forces, were there beforehand, probably long beforehand, hiding in the ghouls and things. Yeah, I suppose one of the big actions before you get to sort of Stanley and the final retaking of Stanley and the end of the actions, Goose Green was one of the big things, and there was a few actions, because you mentioned a few of the hills around. So a lot of the stuff that went down fighting, really close up amongst it in trenches that the Argentines had built in their makeshift defences around sort of farmsteads, homesteads, and sort of remote buildings on the hillsides down there on the Falklands. Yeah, a lot of it was a lot of it did come sort of quite close. So at Goose Green, for example, that is one of the bigger ones, wasn't it? Where quite a few guys died there.
That's where Colonel H. Jones lost his life, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was going to say something about that. Again, that's one of the things that comes up quite often if you sort of read a book or watch a documentary about the Falklands. The story of that. So if anyone doesn't know, it was a very senior guy, Lieutenant Colonel. I mean, he was the commander, the commanding officer of the whole of the 2nd Battalion of the Paras, wasn't he? So I believe so. And that's really quite senior, as I understand it. I've already been corrected on one thing already, and I'm like a proper civvy, get things wrong. At what sort of division level he was, and to have it really clear in my mind how senior he was. Am I wrong to think that being the CO of 2 Para on the ground there, that is really quite senior? Like, he was sort of the if you think of it as probably a bad analogy, but if it was an organism, he's sort of the brain of it. Is that wrong to think of it in those terms? What do you think?
Well, he was the commanding officer of 2 Para, and traditionally the argument would be he should be at the back, dictating or calling out the moves, so to speak, with his radio, via his radio operator. And in this almost kind of Hollywood scenario, he charged an enemy trench and got shot dead in the process. But yeah, it was a shock. I mean, how the hell 2 Para must have felt knowing their commanding officer's dead. Fortunately, they had a chap, Chris Keeble, I think was a major at the time, who stepped up to the plate. Well, that was his job, to step up to the plate if Sunray, as his call sign was, got killed. And apparently he did. He obviously did an excellent job.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's a thing sort of goes back as old as time, to ancient times even. But how much should a commanding officer or a general or something be right up in the thick of it? So, for example, there's quite a few anecdotes of Napoleon getting too far forward and his senior adjutants and officers saying, come on, stop being silly. You've got to get back now. You're actually within range of the cannons. And in World War I, there's lots of examples of generals getting killed. If you look at the lists, there's a fair few names that are generals, and there's generals and then there's generals, but even senior generals were killed in World War I. And it goes back to even ancient times, like, should the king really fight on the front line? Is it prudent? So anyway, I suppose maybe that debate does apply to H, Lieutenant Jones. He did get the VC for that, though, didn't he? I believe he was awarded the VC. And well, I know he was. I read the citation just the other day. And so obviously the powers that be decided it was a great and valiant, gallant action, which it was. I'm not saying it wasn't at all. It was. The only thing I would say, I suppose, just to raise the question, who am I, some YouTube peon, to question a VC? But nevertheless, I mean, it's the job of a historian to ask difficult questions, maybe. Like, if, how to put it diplomatically, but if sort of discretion might have been the more prudent thing in that moment, on that night, in that moment, to charge forward. I've heard accounts of guys that were right there with him that were saying, don't charge forward. Like, if you go around that corner or whatever it was, if you try and charge that trench, you know, don't do that. That's crazy at this moment. And guys said they were saying that to him as he picked up a gun and charged forward. So I don't know. Well, it is what it is. That happened, didn't it?
I think anyone that wins a VC is doing something insane, aren't they? They're not doing what your brain would ordinarily tell you to do. I think there's something about extreme bravery that, God, I think a psychologist could spend hours discussing the factors that lead up to people that do these incredible acts of heroism.
Yeah, I only really mean he was too much of a hero. His balls were too big. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to cast any shadow on him or his memory or what he did at all. I mean, the guy who won the VC, the description of it is crazy. I mean, it's incredible, amazing. You know, there is, as you said straight away, there is just that question of whether it was sort of the most prudent thing for the CO to do. I mean, it says in the citation that the only reason he was there is because he actually really did honestly you know, need to see what was going on. So there was a proper good reason for him to be up there. It was just that sort of final action of running even further forward, and the justification it was to keep the momentum going. But as you said, does that really come within the remit? That's a good way of putting it. Is that really within the remit of his role to do that? That's all. That's all.
Yeah, that's a sort of armchair warriors topic, isn't it?
Yeah, God, I mean, it's easy for me to sit here and say I've never served a day in the services in my life, and just say, was that the right thing to do? I mean, it's kind of,
well, he would have,
gross in a way for me even to question it, but there you go. I mean, got to do it, really.
He must have been under extreme pressure, not just the battle and leading his men into combat, but Goose Green, as far as the tactics were concerned, Goose Green had to be out the way so that they could break out of San Carlos, if I understand correctly. And I guess being pinned down must have been incredibly frustrating. And you're the CO. It's, you know, the ball's in your court. You know, the buck stops with you. Possibly that was, like I say, one of, I've no doubt, many factors in his spur of the moment decision.
Yeah, but I mean, so I think they're at Goose Green, or those various hills around Goose Green that were contended. I mean, I think we're talking like, 400 odd paras versus about 1,500 Argentinian soldiers, whether they were all sort of 19-year-old conscripts, as they're often described. I don't think they were all, I mean, Spud did suggest that they might have been a lot more seasoned than just 19-year-old kids, but anyway, the British forces were outnumbered heavily, but you know, still took those positions and took lots and lots of captives, and they were able to sort of move on to Stanley. And I suppose the final chapters of it, or the various peaks around to the west of Stanley, you know, a lot of them got names people might have heard. You know, Tumbledown, but there's Mount Longdon was one. There's lots of stuff. Mount Harriet, but yeah, you mentioned a couple of others. There's a sort of half a dozen or more. Where lots of firefights went down. The Marines were there, weren't they? And if you want to talk about sort of the final days around Stanley.
Yeah, I mean, the powers were massively up against it, weren't they? They were hugely outnumbered. The BBC had already broadcast to the world that the powers were going to attack at dawn. Fortunately, or allegedly, the Argentine commanders didn't take it seriously. They thought it was a ruse. But you're an 18-year-old para going up a hill knowing you're 3 times outnumbered, plus the fact the enemy knows you're coming. Yeah, they did well. It's a brave thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think you sort of very diplomatically skated over sort of there's an element of treachery there, isn't there? If it was on the BBC, they've sort of given away, regardless of whether the enemy commanders chose to ignore it or not. The BBC did broadcast what the soldiers hadn't done yet, which is, well, that's kind of a betrayal, isn't it? Is it me, or does that sound bang out of order? Oh,
it's despicable.
Right.
You know, it doesn't matter what politics you want to get into. Some people would say, well, a military spokesperson would have told them what to say. It's kind of irrelevant. I think when your country's at war, there's kind of a duty on you to do all you can to support the war effort, isn't there? As long as for moral reasons you agree with it, I'd say. You don't go telling the enemy that 500 men, many of them barely teenagers, who are doing an incredibly brave thing on behalf of their nation, you don't go telling the enemy that they're coming. It must have been incredibly demoralizing.
But well, in the end, Stanley was taken. And well, that was it. The Galtieri government had to concede. I mean, there's something I was going to say earlier on when we started talking about the diplomacy of it and the run up to it. All the diplomats, all the senior guys for America at the UN would say to the Argentines, they would say, look, you know you can't win, right? You know, if the Brits do decide they're going to take them back, they're going to take them back. You can't stop them. So yeah, at what point are you going to back down? And of course they didn't. That was the whole point. So when it came to the end of everything and Stanley had been retaken by British forces, the Galtieri government didn't have much of a leg to stand on, and it fell quite quickly. And I suppose just to put a bow tie on it, what happened? I mean, he lived to be an old man, Galtieri personally. I think there were trials in Argentina through the 80s or from the 80s onwards of people that are in those various governments, those various military junta governments. And I think he did go on trial. Well, he did go on trial at some point and go to prison for a while, but lived to be an old man, and most of it at liberty still. So that's what happened to him. And we know Thatcher went on to, well, she was prime minister for like 10 years or more, wasn't it? She didn't leave until Gulf War I, sort of 1990, 1991, before Major came in. So yeah, that sort of was right near the beginning of her premiership. And as you said, she went from being quite, unpopular, because we had a lot of economic unrest in the 70s as well, sort of 4-day weeks and stuff and blackouts and things. And but we had the boom of the 80s, which in some ways are kind of embodied by Thatcher in some ways, that the boom of the 80s and that whole 10 years. I think of Thatcher in many ways as the 80s, in some sense. So yeah, that was the rest of her story.
God, I remember her coming to power in the 70s. That's right. Showing my age there.
Yeah, and so I suppose that is sort of the story of the Falklands. I just wondered what else you might think about it, or sort of now with sort of decades later, how it sort of exists in the popular consciousness, or how Brits think about it now, or certainly as yourself as a member of the Marines, how it's sort of thought of.
Yeah, I think we should point out here that we've, as we said at the beginning, we were just going to cover this rudimentarily. I'm making up a word there, but just for the purposes of having a chat, weren't we? There's obviously so much more to the conflict in terms of individuals' commitment, the battles that were fought, the events that took place. I would encourage anyone to read read a book on the war. It's one called The Yompers. It's about 4 or 5 commandos, Falklands War. There's one by a chap called Vincent Bramley. He's written 2 books. The first one was about taking Mount Longdon and the Para's role in the Falklands conflict. What's it called?
I was going to say, you could talk for hours just about the battle for Mount Longdon, couldn't you?
Yeah, he's got, I'm just going to look it up. It's something like Descent into Hell or something. But in these books, you're going to hear far more about what actually, I mean, the nitty gritty or the nastiness of what goes on in war than you will by listening to a podcast. Because of course, on a podcast, a soldier, you can't really describe what it's like shoving a bayonet through someone's eye. Do you know what I'm saying? Whereas in a book, you get sort of the more undisclosed narrative. So yeah, Excursion to Hell was his first book, mainly centered on Mount Longdon, and it's a real eye-opener. And his second book was Two Sides of Hell, and in that one, I think he flies to Argentina and he interviews a lot of the Argentinian military or soldiers that fought down there.
Right, who was the guy you had on who wrote a whole book just about the first contact when the Argentinians first took Stanley in the first instance, and there was only 70 or 80 odd Marines on the island that eventually gave up, not surrendered, but eventually put down their arms. You had a guy on who wrote a book all about that. That was extremely interesting.
Yeah, that's Ricky Phillips. He wrote about the first casualty.
The first casualty, right? That's it.
He's just about to release another one, so he'll be back on the podcast to talk about that. I think it's called Voices from Stanley, and it's a collection of the letters that were found that the Argentinian soldiers had written to be sent home, or that were sent home, and Ricky's researched them and he's put them in a book. So I'm looking forward to reading that one. But yeah, the first casualty is about the actual invasion of the Falklands. So not the war itself. And it covers the fight that 8901 Naval Party put up. So that's basically a troop of Marines. I think there was actually 2 troops there at the time that tried to fight off
a few thousand Argentines.
Yeah, I mean, it ended with a ceasefire. The governor, Rex Hunt, people call it a surrender, but apparently it was a ceasefire. They organized a ceasefire. I mean, it would have been pretty foolhardy just to keep fighting, bearing in mind that eventually all the Marines would have been killed, wouldn't they? I mean, what could they do? They could have hidden out in the hills for a few days, possibly a few weeks at most, before running out of food. Certainly no clean drinking water, and of course running out of ammunition. And so the governor, Rex Hunt, made a command decision that he wasn't gonna let that happen. And then the men of that party flew back to the UK via Chile, I think it was. I think they had a big knees up in Chile and drank a hotel dry of something ridiculous. It's quoted as $100,000 worth of alcohol. Then they flew back to the UK and they were repatriated with their units as the task force sailed back down again. So, or I think some of them might have joined their unit at Ascension Island.
That is interesting to know, isn't it? That some of those Marines that put their arms down at Stanley at the very beginning, yeah, they weren't sort of just imprisoned somewhere in Argentina. They were just deported back to Britain, essentially. And then some of the very same guys took the island back. That is a very interesting thing from just a historian's point of view. Very, very interesting. But there's so many, like I say, there are so many stories. I mean, one of the ones we didn't touch on, but I thought was fascinating, is the idea of Operation Mikado. Do you know that one? It was an aborted thing that never happened, but it was this idea when they thought that maybe the Argentine Air Force would get the upper hand against our Sea Harriers, that there was some idea cooked up somewhere that they would parachute in like an entire squadron of the SAS, or one, like just dozens of guys to blow up the Argentinian airfields in Argentina, and then just do a mass escape and evasion thing, classic SAS stuff, but a suicide mission for most of them, you would expect. And that they never did that. They never pulled the trigger on that because it wasn't needed. The Harriers did sort of do the job. But just things like that, I could talk about that for ages, and all the background shenanigans that went on. That's just one story, and that's something that didn't even happen. So yeah, there's so much there to talk about. Hopefully this will just sort of wet the whistle of anyone that's interested in the history of the Falklands War. And as I say, just giving it this grand overview, very broad strokes of the brush. I hope I haven't trod on the toes of the survivors in any way. I hope I've been, as you say, humble enough to talk about it.
No, Bo, I think it's honourable that for someone who was only 1 year old at the time, that you've taken an interest in it, and from obviously let me say a humanitarian perspective, and I'd laud you for that.
Well, thank you. If you ever did want to chat again about anything, I'd love to. If you're particularly interested in what would you be interested in if you did want to chat again? If you've got any particular favourites that you've just read tons about, and
you've done a lot of work on Mao, haven't you, Chairman?
Yeah, I did a massive series on Mao. Yeah,
and the Cultural Revolution. My God, I think if everybody read a book that I read. I've got it here somewhere around, called Wild Swans by Jun Chang, I believe her name is. Have you read it?
Yeah. Well, Yun Chang has written lots and lots of books about the Maoist period. Yeah, she's one of the considered one of the main people at the moment writing about it. Yeah,
she talks about 3 generations of Chinese women growing up under Mao, and it's just an incredibly eye-opening and almost horrifying account, but it's also quite pertinent at the moment when you see some of the stuff that's going on in our society or global society. When you hear terms like the Great Reset and all this kind of communist language, and then you realize that Mao had was it the Great Leap Forward? You can't make sense of what's happening now if you don't know your history. So that's why I think it's great having somebody like you on the podcast.
Oh, cheers. Yeah, like leftist authoritarian censorship. Yeah, if you want to see the extreme ends that goes to, look no further than the Maoist period in China. And as you say, I suppose, and I agree, it is worrying that we're looking at the thin end of the wedge of that right now in our own time and societies, unfortunately, I fear.
Yes, definitely the topic for our next conversation, perhaps.
Oh yeah, I'm happy to revisit Mao, absolutely. Yeah, I actually, in that series, I did 18-part series. One of the first things I did, a bit of an overkill in a way, but I didn't actually focus much on the Cultural Revolution. I spoke loads, mainly really about the Great Leap Forward, which is slightly earlier, about 10 years earlier or so. But I could go into a lot more detail with you about the Cultural Revolution. Yeah, it's a fascinating and horrifying thing, and pertinent as well, perhaps.
Yes, definitely. And your channel is History Bro. Can people just type that into the search box on YouTube and it will come straight up? I'm guessing it does.
Should be able to, yeah. You'll just get History Bro, one word, if you type that in. And I'm on Odyssey now as well. But yeah, History Bro. Excellent.
And if you can send me your social media links, I'll put them below our podcast.
All right, cheers. Yeah, I haven't got many actually, but yeah, I certainly give you what I've got.
Yeah. So to everyone at home, massive thank you for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this chat as much as I have. I strongly encourage you to go and check out Bo's channel. And if you could like and subscribe, that would be wonderful. And Bo, just massive thanks again, mate.
No, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.